Hi, folks. We've got a great panel lined up on what will be an increasingly critical topic as we move from the modernization of national infrastructure to interconnected global commerce with real-time payments. As is always the case in payments, doing so will take the broad ecosystem from regulators to operators to networks to financial institutions to make this all happen. Today's panel will start to unpack the opportunities and the journey ahead of us. I will be the moderator today, and I'm joined by a completely, totally awesome, highly distinguished panel. Kicking us off today will be Butler, the Chief External Relations and Legal Officer for Payments Canada, Steve Ledford, Senior Vice President, Product and Strategy, The Clearinghouse, and Stephen Grainger, Executive Vice President, Mastercard CrossBorder Services. So for just a bit of fun, we're going to put Anne on the hot seat first. Anne, as the National Payment System Operator, who is still in the process of modernizing key domestic rails, why is the notion of cross-border payments important to Payments Canada at this point in time? Over to you.
Oh, thanks, Todd. At least you warned me you were going to ask this question, so I'm ready for it. I want to start my answer actually by talking a little bit about some of the data that you see in Canada and cross-border payments, because I think that's important context for this, and reflect on some of the work that not only Research Payments Canada has done, but others in this space. So firstly, if you look at remittances in 2019 data, which imagine it's even bigger in 2020, there's 14.6 million Canadian customers sending cross-border transactions, $7.2 billion. That's a lot of money going outside the country. 1 in 6 Canadians making those kinds of payments. And, our big remittance partners, the US, of course, 40% of that is going to the US. So, great to have Steve Ledford on the phone to talk about their work in the United States. Asia, of course, and Europe. So very, very big flows going in those directions. Payments Canada also runs payments behavior trackers, so surveys of Canadians, and so both consumers and businesses. And if you think about the feedback we got again in 2019 data, 15% of Canadians are sending regular payments overseas. And, that's typically the issues that they're complaining about. And they do complain about a lot of things with respect to cross-border, the fees and charges, the exchange rates that they're experiencing, the complexity and length of time it takes to get things done, and, traceability, where did it get there? Who's got, where is it in the flow? And then in the business world, 3 in 10 businesses in Canada were sending money overseas in 2019. Again, their issues, speed, security, typical things we all know. These are the issues, and the ease of being able to do it to run their business. So if you think about that was 2019 data, and think about the experience in 2020, right, where we all went online, right? We are all buying from all over the world. So even more so, this is going to be really important. And so with those stats in mind, think about every one of those transactions, unless they're off, put all their money in cryptocurrency and are flying it around the world in that space. The going out leg and the coming in leg is in Canadian dollars. It's going to pass through our systems in one way or the other. So it's really critically important that we have the right national infrastructure to support all that cross-border traffic. And so, that's why, the modernization program that the industry is doing together to install, new high-value system this year, and the real-time rail for Canada is planned for 2022. That's going to be a really critical enabler for this kind of cross-border flows, particularly in a world that's moving even more so into online, even more so into cross-border. Also, the installation of a ISO 20022 data standards, so consistency on both of those systems will be a big enabler up for that. So, I think that's one of the reasons, of course, that we're paying attention to that. It's not just technology. It's also, what are the policies and the rules and standards that are going to support that going forward? And that's a very important part of our focus, why we want to have good standards. What you have to solve for some of the challenges that participants in the payment system face when they're trying to move money cross-border. And so things like, what are the AML and ATF screening standards that they have to meet, the reporting standards, getting consistency And getting all the participants playing the game the same way is going to be really important. And so we have to focus on those kinds of non-technology issues too, to make this work best. And I think that's why, if you look at the Financial Stability Board's work in 2020 around the importance of improving the cross-border experience around the world, one of the big focuses is on, get your domestic rails in order to support it happening. And so it's really important that we do that. In the context of doing that work, we also observe around the world these, some markets are starting to connect their real-time systems. So learning from that, we have this opportunity to make sure we're really educated on what's happening around the world, what's working in terms of connecting infrastructure, and what's working in terms of connecting using private rails to do this, and what will make sense for Canada. So we have to pay attention, learn from that, and make sure we're considering that as we're thinking about the rules and standards and the systems that we're building for the future.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. Steve, over to you. You've been leading much of the cross-border journey at the Clearinghouse. We'd love to hear your views on how TCH started this journey on cross-border payments and what your members are looking for from TCH to do on their behalf.
All right, thank you. And just to provide a little bit of context, we operate a number of payment systems in the U.S., high value, low value, check systems. But I think where we're focusing right now is going to be mostly on some of the instant payment system we operate, the RTP network, which we launched in 2017. Before I go there, though, we are heavily involved already in the cross-border payments in the U.S. The vast majority of cross-border payments that clear and settle in U.S. dollars are clearing and settling on our CHIPS network. And some of the things we've done there to make it better suited for the 24/7 world, we have extended the operating hours of that network so it covers most of the day during the 5 days of the week. We are adopting the ISO 20022 standard. That's going to be going in over the next couple of years. And we also have integrated into our network the ability to participate in the SWIFT GPI, which is already showing a lot of benefits in terms of the transparency and reduction of exceptions for cross-border payments in the way they're currently done through correspondent banks. On the RTP network, we are currently a domestic-only system. It was launched domestic-only, and that was getting back to what Anne said earlier, domestically walk before you run, make sure that you can get the domestic systems where they need to be. And so as we have grown the RTP network, we knew from the very beginning that we wanted to be able to accommodate cross-border payments. And so even though they're not currently permitted, there are a number of things that we've done. The first of which is we made sure that the message standards that we adopted would be able to accommodate the cross-border payments when they were allowed, even though these might be dormant elements right now. They are in message spec, and so we are already in that way ready for cross-border payments when they're permitted. But I would say the most important thing that we have been doing is we have maintained a very close relationship with some of the other operators of the infrastructures around the world. Those who are, operating similar systems to what we're doing with RTP. We've had a dialogue with Payments Canada, for example, that goes back really before we even launched our system to make sure that what we were doing would allow us to coordinate as we went forward. And I would say there are similar things with operators in Europe, the UK, Australia, Asia. We wanted to make sure that we had been talking about these issues so that when we went to implement, we weren't having to start from scratch. And these include things such as, how do you actually coordinate around things like aligning your methods of operation? What you want to do is make that end-to-end payment as close to the domestic experience as you possibly can. And one of the best ways to do that is make sure your domestic experiences are very closely aligned. I think we've done a lot of good work around that. Now, when you use fast payment systems around the world, they increasingly have that same look and feel, and that's going to help a lot too. And the final thing is we have been actively studying how we would move forward in conjunction with our partners around the world so that we are able to take those first steps when our domestic systems are ready.
Thank you very much, Steve. So, Stephen, you have the benefit of seeing a very diverse set of implementations and cross-border payments around the world. how do you see the opportunities for Canada, and how would you rate Canada's current readiness in participating in the future of cross-border payments?
So I come back to things that both Steve and Anne have talked about, and I'll frame that a little bit in the context of the FSB report. So if you look at the FSB report, which is very centered on cross-border payments, it's broken down into 4 core sections, but the things that really strike me is that they call out 19 items of focus areas, and the majority of those are on how do you remove frictions from the way that we think about processing a cross-border payment. And most of those friction points come at the point of a domestic payment. Either think about what a cross-border payment really is. There is a domestic payment on one end, there's a domestic payment and delivery of those funds on the other end, and actually in the middle there's a whole series of functions that occur. And those series of functions, that I think the trick going forward is going to be, how do you make those as seamless and as frictionless as possible to be able to allow for that joined up real-time payment experience that you see at a domestic level. And that's very much something that's on our mind. So I think about some of the work that Steve talked about that TCH are leading to be able to drive that initiative. Think about that's really important. If I think then about what Payments Canada are doing to drive modernization in Canada, that's the prerequisite, if you like, to be able to go and address how do you deal with those friction points that allow us to get to a place of being able to think about enabling cross-border payments. And I think there's an interesting dynamic in all of this, which is still most jurisdictions in the world don't operate with a real-time payments platform. More and more of them are, right? And we see that on every day. The demand for real-time is increasing, but the demand for cross-border real-time and the experiences and the use cases that can enable is critical. But I think the key point, I come back to this FSB report, is how do public bodies and the private sector work together in an effective way to be able to bring down those barriers, to be able to move together in unison. There's a lot that the private sector has already done. A lot of the cross-border initiatives you see today are really led out of the private sector, but they still all contend with the challenges of when can you move money, particularly if you're trying to move money in a RTGS platform. Most RTGS platforms away from the US don't operate most of the day. They operate in very set hours. That carries challenges. How do you deal with financial crime compliance requirements to screen up from a sanctions perspective, to monitor from an anti-money laundering perspective? And those items, there is a race to the top, not a race to the bottom. And so finding an effective way to get to a middle ground that everybody understands the rules, it is kind of an essential place to get to for us to really transform this cross-border payments experience, in my mind. So I think Canada is well positioned with the work that's being undertaken through the modernization agenda, and we are obviously very keen to see how that plays out, and we have an important role in helping to bring that to fruition.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So next one will be to both Anne and Stephen. It'd be great to hear your views on what are some of the major impediments that you think that we need to deal with in Canada to bring about more frictionless and more efficient cross-border payments. And why don't we start with you for 2 minutes?
Sure. So I'll pick up on Stephen's comments and call out, the couple of the things that really are in flight in Canada, but need to get done to really support this. So one of those is the standards, so that the messaging standards, getting us onto the ISO 20022 messaging standard, which will enable more flows to be reliably containing the information needed to comply with sanctions, screening laws, and the information needed to support the business models of the customers. The other is the 24/7 nature of the real-time system, including that the settlement's going to be happening and the central bank will be able to support that. That's a really important thing that needs to get done to support this moving forward. Then the other areas that I think are that Stephen called out that are really important is really thinking about what things you need to fix and at what level of the system. So what I mean by that is when you're looking at the pain points, what of the pain points, as Stephen called out, can be solved by the private sector? So that can be actually more easily solved by the private sector, and where innovation and freedom of action without regulatory, heavy regulatory constraint will be enabling. What parts will be solved, should be solved, and can be solved and be helpful to the system for the infrastructures and operators like Payments Canada to make sure things work smoothly. And then where do you actually need regulatory help to make it all work? And I think that's a thing we need to pay some attention to, learn from what's happening in the markets internationally, and really be thoughtful in Canada about how we solve that with the tools that we have, so that we are enabling the innovation and not constraining it. Those are kind of my thoughts of reflecting on Stephen's comments.
That's great. Over to you, Stephen.
Look, I think there's no getting around it. Change is hard, right? And to engineer change is difficult. And so if I was looking at this from a purely Canadian perspective, you look at the modernization agenda, there is a huge amount of work there to undertake for all the stakeholders involved. And then you start to layer on other change. When we talk about this conversation of cross-border, it's another set of changes. But I think what we've seen broadly is when you start to think about payment modernization, it can have a transformative effect on the way that we think about not just payment. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to do a payment. Right. A payment is the outcome of some other exercise, and that's what needs to become frictionless. And I think what's at the heart of this is, how do you transform some of the business models and turn them on the head? So there are some initiatives that are out there that, yes, they've been very impactful, but really, what do they do? They're just making the current process a little bit better. And I think what's on our collective mind is, how do you change that process completely and turn that on its head? And I think one of the continuing changes that we see is that increasingly, when you take into account things like the impact of regulation on a bank, and I think I'll call out banks in particular, they increasingly do not want to hold capital outside of their home jurisdiction. They don't want to hold liquidity in nostro-vostro relationships. But the current model of moving money cross-border is kind of underpinned by that very premise. So the real opportunity is, how do we do different? How can you turn that model on its head? Can you turn that model on its head? How do you do it differently? Recognizing, to Anne's point earlier, that actually, the inflow and the outflow, more likely than not, even with the advent of digital coins, whichever form they take, people still most likely want to have a real fungible pool of liquidity, which is going to be Canadian dollars or US dollars, or that account where they collect that liquidity into a place where they can reuse it in whichever way they want. And I think that that's where we've got to challenge ourselves to think about, how can we do differently. And I think the modernization agenda in Canada, the work that TCH in particular have led in the US to drive change, these are all critical building blocks to help us put us in a better place to be able to do different and to drive much more impactful change.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a great segue to you, Steve. It would be great to understand what TCH is currently doing to address the types of issues that Stephen and Anne have raised in the U.S. market, and how you're partnering with other networks and operators to bring about this profound change.
Yeah. Well, first of all, while you're operating a domestic system, you can start trying out things that will be useful when you do end up going to cross-border payments. And so, one of the things that Anne mentioned was that the fact that when you have an instant payment system, you end up going into a 24/7 world. And in fact, in some of the consultations we've had with others around the world, they did mention that cross-border payments, the way folks want them to be done as frictionless as possible, in the end, it will be easier if you are going into an instant payment network because of that 24/7 nature. However, just because our payment system, the RTP network, does operate 24/7 doesn't mean that you have total free ability to move liquidity during that period. Over the weekends, for example, and during a certain period every night, the Federal Reserve is closed. We don't actually settle at the Federal Reserve, but that is a source of funds that come into and out of our liquidity pool. So what we've had to do is work with the participating banks, as well as parties, banks that act as funding agents for other, to help them plan for the liquidity and also create what would in essence be a market for liquidity during periods when the Federal Reserve is not open. And if you look at that and apply it on a global basis, that model we've learned actually could apply. This idea of other providers of liquidity using the liquidity that's already in the system more efficiently could be important when you're talking about whether it's cross-border pools of liquidity or even just better avoid the need for someone to hold liquidity in a network which is not a participant. Another part of it would be if you speed up payment execution. In other words, the payments that go out immediately go back into the other system. That's going to reduce the need to hold as much liquidity. So thinking about ways that you can avoid the kinds of exceptions that might stop the movement of payments will help a lot. If I know that if I'm sending money into Canada and my dollars flow and seconds later they'll flow into Canada, I don't need to worry about holding as much liquidity with a correspondent or some other party. And so thinking about those things that get rid of the exception is important. We spent a lot of time. We scrutinize rejects to what might be called an obsessive amount just to reduce those points. And that's a lot of just good old-fashioned rolling up your sleeve and working with the participating financial institutions so you can find what the causes are and reduce them. And we've actually reduced our reject rate by well over half just in the last year or so by scrutinizing things like that. That helps us domestically, but it will definitely help us internationally. The other thing is making sure, even though they might not be as widely used right now, the parts of the system, the message that will be important going forward, we do test for those. We make sure that the participants can handle those, so they won't have to go through as much of an implementation effort when we do enable cross-border payments. And the final thing, and I think this is interesting that it was mentioned, where one actually holds one's funds. We do have mechanisms. Right now, a lot of the money that is going in and out of the RTP network is actually coming from digital wallets. And that could serve as a proxy for some of the other ways of holding these cross-border assets. And so think about it this way. It's not the glamorous bits that we're working on right now. What we're doing is we're working on some of the boring, tedious bits, but it's engineering that's going to be vitally important when you get to the cross-border where there are more different moving parts to contend with.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. So, Stephen, you've been partnering with TCH from the glorious to the tedious bits. And so it would be great to understand some of the things that you think from that experience can be brought to Canada, as well as some of the issues that we should hope to avoid.
And look, on this one, I'd say, I'm sure Steve's got his own opinions on this one as well. The reality is, we started working with TCH very early on in the process where we were starting to roll out cross-border payment platforms beyond the UK. We'd done it with Singapore, we'd done it in Thailand, and then we moved to working with TCH in the US. I think what is clear is that since that point in time, sorry, I have a dog that has arrived on the scene, so this is Henry for everybody. Welcome to Payments Canada. And so what I'd say is, we've learned a lot. We've implemented significantly more of these platforms. Our ability to be able to deliver, a real-time payment ecosystem is much more effective. Our ability to be able to work with our partners and our scheme operators to be able to drive the right circumstances, the right environment in the market to adopt change is much more effective. But as I said earlier, whatever we do, whatever learnings we have, the trick is change is still difficult. This is it's another change to be able to that banks and participants in Canada have got to work through. I do think that one of the things that helps in this situation is that Canada, from a sheer number of banks perspective, there is an easier amount of banks to be able to work with in Canada that can drive change arguably in a reduced time frame, and therefore maybe get to the point of delivering the benefit of what real-time payments and the transformative benefit that real-time payments can bring in a quicker time frame. And that is, the reality is in the US there are a huge number of banks. To try to coordinate that group of people is difficult to do. So everyone has their own agenda, and so I think that's what we are very optimistic about, the opportunity in Canada, and then what it means to be able to enable, and be the supplier for real-time payments in Canada and the US. And how do we is there a way to drive synergy value over the top of that?
Well, and you have the benefit of sitting at the crossroads of members, stakeholders, regulators, corporates, you name the long list of folks in the Canadian payments ecosystem. It'd be great to hear more from you around what are the benefits that end users are really trying to drive? What's a compelling set of benefits that these folks are trying to see realized for them?
I thank you for that question, Todd, because I was getting a little depressed about the tedious nature of my work, reflecting on Steve's comments. So actually, we do have this benefit and responsibility, I would say, to be, to try to be as informed as possible of the wider Canadian ecosystem, not just the participant members of Payments Canada, but also the users of the payment systems. And I think I'll reflect back on my earlier comments about the post-COVID recovery in Canada, the online nature of our business world, and people are living across the country and dialing in over the computer to their work, and around the world with many organizations. And so what we're hearing from, whether it's consumers or small businesses, is the importance of having the capability to move the money quickly, to have good funds quickly, and to be able to enable, particularly with small and medium-sized businesses, enable their international business, right? This is a great opportunity for Canada, if we get it right during the recovery, to really support this our big cities are growing, top financial centers, great fintech growth. It's a great opportunity for us. So we hear a lot around the importance of the payment systems and enabling cross-border being a really important part of what needs to happen in Canada. And then if I think about, from the perspective of members, of course, who are investing massively in the change, in the modernization of the payment systems in Canada, we want to get the value out of those investments. So supporting, it's Payments Canada's responsibility to be supporting what members and participants need to get the value out of their investments, and that includes making sure that they can enhance their cross-border. I think some of the big pains that you hear from participants in the system relate to the complexity of this cross-border stuff, right? So if you're thinking about the sanctions screening and reporting requirements, these are big pain points for any participant in any payment system around the world. The rules are not consistent. They're not always implemented with an understanding of the actual business processes. And those are areas that I think we need to focus on and be supporting to help participants take advantage of what's being put in place and to improve the cross-border flows. I think that the other area is, around who's playing on the systems, and is there consistent regulatory oversight of all the players to make sure that you can trust your counterparties to be giving you the data that you need to comply with your regulatory obligations. So I think those are very important places for organizations like Payments Canada, participants, and the regulators to be thinking about, because those are regulatory rocks that are in the way. They're big frictions that need to be removed to make the system work better. So a couple of thoughts from my perspective.
Todd, I just wanted to come back on one of the things that Anne said, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's on my mind, particularly when we think about real-time payments and the benefits that real-time payments brings, it is to consumers, it is to small and medium-sized enterprises. And so, what you're not just getting fast, you're not necessarily just getting payments delivered cheaply. What you're really getting is, you're getting payments delivered with predictability and certainty. right? You know what's going to happen. And when you've got predictability and certainty, actually you can manage your cash flows in a much more effective way. You can build new experiences. You can enable new use cases to be able to kind of service those segments. When you translate that into a cross-border context, one of the challenges we have is that the bits that if I looked at a bank, if I looked at a retail bank where consumers and SMEs are typically serviced from, they are price takers often from another part of the bank that is disassociated from that ultimate end user experience. And so I think one of the challenges that I think is on the horizon is how do we better enable, how do we plug into more effectively the customer, the consumer, the SME, to be able to solve their needs and capture their flows within, in this case, the bank. A lot of this impact is falling on the banks. How do we re-enable them? How do we re-engage them to win back flow? Because right now, from a cross-border perspective, a lot of this retail and SME remittance flow is being driven into digital platforms. That might be the right way to do it. It might not be the right way to do it. But the fact of the matter is, the incidence of change is being felt by the banks. They're also at points a little bit powerless to be able to capture the flow that is flowing away from them. So we've got to get a little bit more joined up in thinking about how we better service our customers in a more effective way.
So, Stephen, maybe I could ask you to continue on with that theme to point us to some of the really interesting developments or very interesting case studies from other markets that you think we should all be paying attention
to. So look, I think the one that continually sticks out for me when we think about where we've deployed real-time payment platforms elsewhere is what's happened in Thailand. So you go and do the deep dive into that, and actually real-time payments has become the backbone that has enabled a complete transformation in the way that government, for example, engages with its citizens, the way it moves money to citizens, the way the speed with which it can move money to those citizens, has become far more compelling and far more effective, and actually has removed not just a lot of friction, but also a lot of the unnecessary noise that it means to be able to receive money through a banking system. It's enabled the emergence of new wallets to be able to go and support those customers. And so it's driven a huge amount of innovation within Thailand in a way that we had never anticipated when we started down that project and rolling that out with ITMX. And so, on top of that, you see the emergence of new use cases like how do insurance companies more effectively get money to the single point of liquidity, a bank account, at the point in time where somebody's in a moment of distress, the house is burnt down, they've got a claim, they need money now, right? The ability to be able to push funds quickly into an individual and through a mechanism that will credit funds into that account almost immediately has become unprecedented. The ability to be able to go and buy a car and receive loan funds almost immediately, we've seen elsewhere in other jurisdictions. And so, I think that the real benefit here comes to the consumer. It comes to the it comes to the small and medium-sized enterprise. And so, I think that's what it's. The more you peel back, the more you see how transformative the power of real-time payments actually is to enable, a different way of doing business, a different way of being able to engage with a customer through a mechanism that is accessible to almost everybody who participates in that jurisdiction is unparalleled, I think. So that's where I'd say on that one.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Over to you. And as you think about the role that Payments Canada is playing and the broad ecosystem of participants here, how do you think about our opportunities to leverage the learnings that Steve and Stephen have talked about to move ahead most effectively in Canada?
So I think, we talked a little bit earlier about the the size of the market in Canada and the opportunity Stephen spoke about of us to be able to collaborate effectively and really move and in coordination in a way that's different than some of the other markets that are larger. And so I think we've already, we're already working very hard together to modernize the payment infrastructure. I think that we should be, continuing that momentum to think about what are the real problems that need to be solved for our participants and their customers in Canada to make cross-border payments easier and more valuable for the Canadian economy. And I think for that, it's really important to study and understand what's happened in other markets. So the example that Stephen provided around what's happening in Thailand, for instance, to really work closely with Steve and what's happening at TCH, so we can actually have this opportunity in a way to gather the information of what's going on in some of the tests that are happening in other countries, understand it relative to the structure of our ecosystem here in Canada, so that we can be thoughtful about what to work on first, and what will be most enabling. If you think about the flows that could pass between Canada and the United States, right? Well, how do we feel about where we prioritize our work to support improved cross-border payments? What can you leverage the capacity of Payments Canada to do to help, whether that's in the infrastructure itself or in the rules and standards that surround it, or in the advocacy needed to get the regulatory environment in the right place. And I think that's the opportunity for us as an ecosystem, is to continue to work together on what needs to be fixed in the center and get that right so that we can enable the market to innovate on top of it. And I think if we keep that as sort of our North Star, that will be really important for success in this.
So Stephen and Steve, when you think about the North Star that Anne is describing, it would be great to get your views on what are some of the biggest opportunities that you think we should be focused on here. So Stephen, maybe I'll start with you and then we'll go to Steve.
I'm sure everybody's bored of hearing me talk, Todd, but and so Steve, everyone would be delighted to hear you in a second. But here's what's on my mind. I think that in a world where we become the real-time payment infrastructure provider in Canada, and being the real-time payment infrastructure provider in the US, for me, the biggest opportunity is how can we drive that role of defining synergy between those two jurisdictions. There are huge trade flows. There are huge remittance flows that exist between the two jurisdictions. And actually, it is the best opportunity, I think, that exists out there of being able to create genuinely frictionless and domestic-looking cross-border movements of funds between Canadian dollars and US dollars. I think to do that effectively, what we've got to do is be clear which bit of that process becomes commoditized. And I think the data flow, the messaging, the orchestration, that is the commoditized story in this. It's also the most valuable bit of that story. How do you allow really effective data to be able to move between two different platforms across two borders, to be able to enable much more effective trade without getting in the way today of the value add component? And I think the value add depends where you sit. For some people, that could be data. For others, for the banks, it will be how do you not intermediate the FX business to be able to allow the banks to still capture value on an area where they're capturing value today. But it's my firm belief, right, that banks in their own right don't necessarily want to do payments. Right? As we touched on earlier, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I want to do payments. Right? Payments come from the outcome of another activity. And for a bank, the core of their business is they are risk managers. How do they lend against their balance sheet? How do they deliver value-added services to customers? Payments become a factor that flow off the back of those outcomes. So finding a way to be able to take away processing pain from an institution and being able to allow them to concentrate on the areas where they can most effectively make money is I think a real opportunity that we can enable through our partnership with Payments Canada and TCH as routes and mechanisms into their own communities and ecosystems.
So Steve, over to you. We'd love to hear your views on the big opportunities that you think we should be focused on here.
Okay, I need to start first by strenuously disagreeing with one thing Stephen said. He said, no one wakes up saying, I want to do payments. I do that every day. And so maybe I'm just an anomaly.
You're well surrounded by the payment geek squad.
Right. But in terms of opportunity, I would look at it this way. We have a tremendous opportunity between the US and Canada to do a lot of really good things. One of the things we should really continue to do, because I think we are doing this to a certain extent, is leverage our common constituencies. There are banks that operate in a significant way, both sides of the US-Canadian border. We listen to them, Payments Canada listens to them, and we're going to learn a lot from them because they are one step closer to the end users of payments than we are. There are also other constituents. One of the most useful things that we did at setting up the RTP network is we started a corporate advisory council. We don't directly serve corporations. I think the model that you have in Canada, where you have a broad constituency, already helps. But listen to the folks who operate both sides of the border. They'll tell us what they need, what the pain points are, and more importantly, what the source of some of these pain points are. So I think that's the start of the opportunity, is being able to listen and listen well to folks who actually know what's happening on both sides and take that to heart to make sure that we're building that into whatever we do. The second thing I would say is, and Anne, I think you said it beautifully, what can we do at the central infrastructure to enable innovation? But it's very easy to get outside of that and try to over predict what folks are going to be using these kinds of networks for, and try to say you should be using it for this use case or that use case. You need to provide a little bit of direction, but the reality is that the innovators in the market, the end users, are going to find things that are much more creative than we would ever tell them to do. And so I think that that's going to be another important part of it. If you had asked me 3 years ago if payroll would be one of the major uses of the RTP network, I would have said, no, direct deposit works. Well, obviously, there were certain things folks wanted to do a little differently, and so we're seeing that. And I think the third one, and I think Stephen pointed to this a bit, is because we're working with a common provider of the core technology we're working with, we can probably help provide direction based on our learnings in our in North America that can help in making sure that platform progresses in ways that helps us to do what we need to do. Make sure we don't have conflicting requirements, that type of thing. And so there's a lot of things we can do. The obvious end result is exactly what has been pointed to already. There's a tremendous amount of payment flow that either happens or needs to happen across this border, whether it's companies that are buyers and sellers, whether it's individuals. And I think that the more that we can learn from each other, we learn from experiences in Canada, some of the things we're experiencing here, and we can apply them and make the most of them in this cross-border context.
So, and if we could make you the all-powerful regulator for payments in Canada, right? So you've got the complete authority to solve all the big issues. What would be the big issues at the top of your plate that you'd want to see solved?
So you're going to get me in a lot of trouble with regulators, right, Todd, for taking on a question like this. So thanks. Canada's regulatory environment is really complex in payments, right? There's a lot of regulators with fingers in the game. So to be able to think about having that all in one place is a very empowering thought. I would want to see, that there are really clear, fair, and transparent rules that apply across the nation, that the participants are all playing by the same rules and know the rules of the game, so that you have, I've used this description before, that the trust of the system is ensured by the consistency of how everybody's required to play. We don't have that yet in Canada, and it's a thing we should be working hard on. And then how do we have consistent experience and protections for the end users in the system? That's a thing that we would need to work on. And in a federal political structure, this is a tough thing for our country. If I had a magic wand, I would fix AML, ATF sanctions screening and reporting. It's but I don't think you can do that being the regulator, the single regulator of payments for Canada. You'd actually have to give me the power for the whole world, Todd. So, like I think that's a thing that needs to be solved. It needs to be solved. It's a very burdensome and inconsistent, and that's a challenge for the cross-border payment space. And if you gave me that power, supreme commander of the universe or whatever, you would want to solve data privacy standards. You'd want to make sure that each of the participants is playing by the same rules, so that the recipient in Canada knows that counterparty is doing the same things, and so there's the risk is reduced for playing the game. And I think, and obviously that's a big dream, but those are important things to solve, get more consistency for, I think.
So, Steve, if you look at how things have played out in the U.S., you've dealt with a number of these types of issues to varying degrees, like Anne just raised. It'd be great to get your advice on some of the optimal ways that we can deal with driving adoption, connectivity, putting some of these regulatory issues into a structure where we can best deal with them, as well as looking at, how partnerships, play out in this cross-border space. So, Steve, over to you.
Okay. Well, first, if we're voting on whether Anne should be the global regulator of payments, I'll vote yes. And so let me get that out of the way. In terms of optimal, I don't know if we found the optimal. I can tell you some of the things that we've learned along the way. One of the first is when you're talking about things like adoption, connectivity, getting these things rolling, use to the greatest extent possible structures or relationships, entities that are already out there doing this business. For example, connectivity. We realized that we'd be able to directly connect with a number of larger institutions, but that the vast majority, we have over 10,000 financial institutions in the US, and the vast majority of them would not be able to connect directly to it. It's just that there was just not the ability to do that much engineering work. So we very early on started working with the large providers of services to these players to make sure that they were able to do it. In fact, one of the things we asked the folks at Mastercard to do was structure our infrastructure, the system, so that it could handle these very complicated, in some cases, relationships. And so we leveraged third-party service providers, bankers, banks, corporate credit unions, to play various roles. They were already there. They were already doing it. This is not something that we invented. And that's been very helpful in helping us to reach as much of the country as possible. In terms of adoption, again, part of it is having the foresight to build capabilities into the payment system that could be leveraged in a variety of different ways. We were not overly specific in terms of things like you use this message for this kind of payment. And that was based on lessons we learned over the last 30, 40 years, where sometimes that got to be too rigid of a structure for some of the more innovative uses. But the other thing, and this is something that was largely done by the participants in the system, some of the banks, was to take existing products and services, and one of the quickest things you can do is add this additional capability. If you think about when you're starting doing anything, so there's a lot of improvisation going on. The first rule of improvisation is to say yes and. So we saw folks adding real-time payments to things like their disbursement products, their receivable products, their commercial porters, their account-to-account transitions. One of the other things is leveraging things like the digital wallets, the payroll companies, folks like that, and working with them to make it as easy as possible to implement what you're doing. And so that's one of the things. In terms of things like regulation, don't keep your regulators in the dark. I don't think that's happening at all in Canada, by the way. I think you've done an excellent job of working very closely with the various authorities. But one of the things that we did very early on is start talking to the various regulators, whether it was the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, whether it was the OCC, whether it was the Federal Reserve, about what we were doing and what we were planning as we went through, because it's never a good idea to surprise your regulators. And we also realized it wasn't just us working with the regulators, but we needed to work with the folks at the financial institutions who are in charge of compliance, because when it comes right down to it, they're the ones who are going to be responsible for meeting whatever requirements they are. And there, it was a lot of listening and then saying, is there something that we can do to help facilitate that behind the scenes? Did we do it optimally? No. Hindsight is always 2020, but hopefully these lessons learned will be helpful.
So, Stephen, over to you for our final question. When you look at the role that Mastercard's playing with its clients in Canada as a partner to Payments Canada and as well as a global network, what are some of the things that you see us being able to do to accelerate the realization of faster, better cross-border payments in Canada?
I say all my best things on mute, actually, Todd. So you just missed out on a cracker. But look, I think it's a great question. If you break down, when I break down what Mastercard is, right, we have a broad range of customers, but at its heart, it is an interbank network. One, it grew up as a facilitator of enabling cross-border payments. How do you connect one domestic scheme here to one domestic scheme there and drive value for customers? And that relationship and that engagement that it has with those customers that sit around that who use Mastercard is that it's underpinned by a scheme. And I think that in all truth, if we want to really think about how do we take cross-border payments forward, if we really want to get to a place where they can become as seamless and as frictionless as domestic payments, ultimately what we need to get to a place is of a rules-based outcome. We need a scheme wrapper that sits around different operators where when they participate in that scheme, they know what's going to happen. And I come back to these terms, predictability and certainty. I think everybody needs predictability and certainty to be able to drive forward effective and create effective value propositions for their customers. So, and what is a scheme at the end of the day? It is a known series of outcomes. It's a rules-based framework that says, I do this, this happens, right? And that's where I think we've got to step away from a world where cross-border is defined by bilateral relationships and the complexities that come with in a world defined by bilateral relationships to a much more multilateral framework. And in many respects, that is what TCH are. That is what Payments Canada are. They're enabling a multilateral engagement model with all of their customers and all of the stakeholders that exist in the jurisdictions that they operate in. And I think that's the sweet spot for Mastercard to drive value across all of our stakeholders, and our customers are your stakeholders and your customers, Anne and Steve. And so, I think that together we can facilitate something truly remarkable if, the broad group of stakeholders in this space are keen and interested to do something different and challenge ourselves to find new ways to make money and new ways to drive value. And I think that's what I think is quite compelling. If I go back and I use an example of mobile telephone operators, if I sit in the UK, so in the glorious world where we sat in the EU, all of a sudden I didn't come back from a trip to Brussels or a trip to Spain with a £500 phone bill because I've been calling people back in the UK. I spent £5 a day. And so mobile operators found a different way to be able to make money in a world where, the dynamics of that cross-border movement have been fundamentally changed around them. And so people still make money in that space. The way they make money is different. And so I think we need to find ways to be able to create the dynamic, create the visual of where there is new value to be extracted in this space, not just from the old bilateral model of how we think about cross-border payments today.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I think you'll all agree that was a really exciting panel. Thanks, Mastercard, for hosting this panel, and thank you very much to Anne, Steve, and Stephen for your insights today. Hope you folks have a great rest of the summit. Cheers.